Section 50 of All About Coffee. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Casey Roddy. All About Coffee by William Ukers. Some Big Men and Notable Achievements, Part 2. Jabez Burns, inventor, manufacturer, writer. Jabez Burns was a person of real importance to the American coffee trade from 1864, when he began to manufacture his improved roaster until his death at the age of 62 in 1888. His success depended more on unusual character than unusual ability, although he was really gifted as regards mechanical invention. He loved to acquire practical information and arrived confidently at common-sense conclusions, and he exercised a wide and helpful influence because he liked to give expression to opinions that he considered sound and useful. Mr. Burns was born in London in 1826. The family moved soon after to Dundee, Scotland, and came to New York in 1844. They were people of small means and independent thinking. The father, William G. Burns, had been more interested in the Chartist social movement than in any settled business activity. An uncle, also named Jabez Burns, became a popular Baptist preacher in London. The first winter in America found youthful Jabez teaching a country school at Summit, New Jersey. Then he began in New York from 1844 to 1845 as teamster for Henry Blair, a prosperous coffee merchant who attended a little disciples' church in Lower 6th Avenue, where many Scottish families congregated. There also Burns met Agnes Brown, daughter of a Paisley weaver, and married her in 1847. A brave young pair they were, who found all sorts of odd riches, just as if a fast-growing family could somehow make up for a slow-growing income. There were hopes, too, that the contrivances Burns kept inventing might bring wealth, and some extra money did come from the sale of early patents, including one from 1858 for the Burns Atometer, a primitive adding machine. But Mr. Burns had continued regularly in the employ of coffee and spice firms, and at one time he was bookkeeper for Thomas Reed's Globe Mills. He advanced slowly because he lacked real trading talent, but he was learning all about the handling of goods from purchase to final delivery, and when he quit bookkeeping for the old Globe Mills and began to build his patent roaster, he could advise clients reliably about every factory detail. He was soon looked on as an authority. He wrote some articles for the American Grocer, a series on food adulteration being reprinted, and in 1878 he began the quarterly publication of his 32-page Spice Mill, which soon became a monthly and gained the attention of practically the entire coffee and spice trade. Through the columns of this paper in circulars, by letters, and in a pocket volume called the Spice Mill Companion, he distributed information on coffee, spices, and baking powder, and gave valuable advice to beginners in the coffee roasting business. Not a few coffee roasters were started on the way to fortune by the counsel of Jabez Burns. He died in New York, September 16, 1888. Jabez Burns founded the business of Jabez Burns & Sons in 1864, beginning the manufacture of his patent coffee roaster at 107 Warren Street, New York. Since then, there have been 4 removals. In December 1908, the business moved to its present uptown location at the northwest corner of 11th Avenue and 43rd Street, occupying a 6-story building, which was doubled in size in 1917. This Burns factory has been referred to as the unique coffee machinery workshop, the greatest establishment of its kind in the United States. Upon the death of its founder, the business was continued, first as the firm of Jabez Burns & Sons, composed of his sons Jabez, Robert, and A. Lincoln Burns, and later in 1906 incorporated as Jabez Burns & Sons Incorporated, with Robert Burns as president, Jabez Burns as vice president, and A. Lincoln Burns as secretary and treasurer. Jabez Burns died August 6, 1908. The present officers are Robert Burns, President, A. Lincoln Burns, Vice President, William G. Burns, general manager, and C. H. McLaughlin, secretary and treasurer. A. Lincoln Burns succeeded his father as editor of the spice mill. William H. Ukers was made editor in 1902, and he continued until 1904, when he left to assume editorial direction of the Tea and Coffee Trade Journal. Coffee trade booms and panics. In the last 50 years, there have been many specular attempts to corner the coffee market in Europe and the United States. The first notable occurrence of this kind did not originate in the trade itself. It took place in 1873, and was known as the J. Cook Panic, being brought about by the famous panic of that name in the stock market. As a result of the J. Cook failure, it was impossible to obtain money from the banks. Hence, buyers were forced to keep out of the coffee market, and as a consequence, the price for Rios dropped from 24 cents to 15 cents in the course of the trading period of one day. Another interesting development during that year was of foreign origin. A coffee syndicate was organized in Europe, financed by the powerful German trading company of Frankfurt, with agencies in London, Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Brazil. For more than 8 years, this proved to be a highly successful undertaking, largely controlling the principal producing and consuming markets. As far as the American coffee trade is concerned, the first sensational upheaval took place in 1880 to 81. This period witnessed the collapse of the first great coffee trade combination in this country, the so-called syndicate, comprising O.G. Kimball, B.G. Arnold, and Bowie Dash, sometimes known as the Trinity. The period of high coffee prices, commencing in 1870, had greatly stimulated production in many mild coffee-producing countries, as well as in Brazil, and as a consequence, the syndicate found its burden becoming extremely heavy early in 1880. In January of that year, our visible supply amounted roughly to 767,000 bags. While this was reduced to about 740,000 bags in July, the latter likewise proved to be decidedly burdensome, especially as another liberal crop was beginning to move in producing countries. The excessive volume of supplies was especially marked because distributing trade during the summer was strikingly dull, as the majority of buyers were holding off in view of the prospective liberal new crop. At that time, Java coffee was a big item in American markets, whereas Santos was just about beginning to be a factor. The syndicate found that it had its hands full supporting the Brazil grades, and hence had to let the Javas go. As a result, the latter, which had sold at 24 3/4 cents in January 1880, fell to 19 1/2 cents in July, to 18 cents in November, and to 16 cents in December. As a matter of fact, the syndicate was practically the only buyer of Brazil coffee during the fall of 1880, and as a consequence, Rios, which had started the year at 14 1/2 to 16 1/4 cents, were down to 12 3/4 cents in December 1880, and had dropped 9 1/2 cents when the break in the market culminated in June 1881. The first whispers of financial troubles growing out of these adverse conditions were heard in October 1880, and on the 27th of that month the first failure was announced, that of C. Risley and Company, with liabilities placed at $800,000 and assets at $400,000. This firm had been doing business in the local market for about 30 years. The efforts of the receivers to dispose of this company's large stock naturally served to accelerate the decline, and the final impetus came on December 6th, when the New York trade heard of the death, 2 days previously, of O.G. Kimball of Boston, one of the most prominent merchants there. This precipitated the big crash of December 7th, when B.G. Arnold and Company, the largest New York firm, suspended with estimated liabilities of $750,000 to $1 million. The official statement later placed the liabilities at $2,157,914 and assets at $1,400,000, of which $884,198 were secured. Within 3 days, this failure was followed by the suspension of Bowie, Dash & Company, with liabilities estimated at $1,400,000. For weeks thereafter, there was virtually no market. With all of these distress holdings pressing for liquidation, buyers, as natural, were extremely timid. In the meantime, the import arrivals showed further enlargement at various southern ports, as well as at New York. Total arrivals at this point during 1881 were almost 12,400,000 pounds heavier than for the preceding year. The growing importance of Santos as a market factor was demonstrated by the fact that shipments from there in 1881 were 1,198,625 bags, compared with about 628,900 bags in 1876-77. According to the best informed members of the trade at that time, the losses sustained by the various firms that were forced to the wall aggregated between $5 million and $7 million. The utterly demoralized conditions prevailing while this collapse was in progress, and the practical elimination of a market in the true sense of the word, furnished the principal impetus for the organization of the New York Coffee Exchange. At that time, the Havre market was the only one with an exchange. The local body was organized in December 1881 and started business in March 1882. The Cable Break of 1884. The second noteworthy movement, embracing an advance of 4 to 4 1/2 cents and a recession of slightly more than 3 cents, covered a period of about 8 months shortly after the exchange was organized. Various local and out-of-town firms were interested in the bulge which carried Rio coffee in this market from about 7 cents in July 1883 up to 11 1/2 cents late in December. By the middle of December, the price had fallen to 9 1/4 cents, the final break to 8 1/4 cents occurring late in March of the following year. At that time, there was no direct cable communication with Brazil, and as a result of a temporary break in the roundabout service by way of Portugal, the New York and Baltimore agents of the Brazilian syndicate were unable to put up additional margins in this market, and their accounts were closed out. This happened on a Saturday, and by the following Monday, partial cable remittances arrived and all accounts were settled in full, with interest from Saturday to Monday. The Great Boom. What is generally described as the great boom of the coffee trade occurred in 1886-87 and had its inception in unsatisfactory crop news from Brazil. The crop of 1887-88, it was estimated, would be extremely small, and it turned out to be only 3,033,000 bags. These advices and low estimates led to the formation of a bull clique comprising operators in New York, Chicago, New Orleans, Brazil, and Europe, who set a price of 25 cents for December contracts as their goal. Toward the end of June 1886, when this campaign started, No. 7 Rio in New York was worth about 7 1/2 cents, with June contracts on the exchange quoted at 7 65/100 cents. With Brazilian crop news still more discouraging, the advance thereafter was almost continuous, and on June 1, 1887, December contracts sold at 22 1/4 cents, a new high price record that was not exceeded for 32 years, when 24 65/100 cents were paid for July contracts in June 1919. After reaching 22 1/4 cents, prices suffered an abrupt reversal. 10 days later, the closing price for December was 21 4/10 cents. Then the real crash began. On Saturday, June 11th, the panic started with another claim of cable trouble, and in the short session, December coffee broke from 20 15/100 to 18 65/100 cents, closing at a loss for the day of 275 points. The first sale of December on Monday was at 17 4/10 cents, or 125 points lower, and after numerous erratic variations, the price broke to 16 cents, a drop of 6 1/4 cents in less than 2 weeks. Business on that day was of enormous volume, in round numbers, 412,000 bags, and approximately $1,500,000 was put up in margins. For the next 3 days, the decline was temporarily halted, and December, at one time, was up 3 1/4 cents from the bottom, 19 1/4 cents. On June 17th, another battle commenced, December dropping back to 17 cents. Then came a rally to 18 1/10 cents, a drop to 16 1/2 cents, another rally to 18 1/10, and on June 24th, another break to the previous low level of 16 cents for December. This sharp reversal in less than a month was traceable largely to more favorable news from Brazil, the 1888-89 crop being estimated at 6,827,000 bags. Following a rally to 19 6/10 cents during the next month, July 1887, the pendulum again swung downward. The climax came with the culmination of the European fiasco of the spring of 1888. Reports were received that various European coffee firms had failed, and future contracts in the American market sold as low as 9 cents in March. A famous European bull campaign. The next campaign of interest lasted more than 2.5 years. In September 1891, there was a corner in the local market which forced the September price up to 17 1/4 cents. George Kaltenbach, a wealthy speculator living in Paris, combining with 3 operators in Havre, Hamburg, and Antwerp, succeeded in breaking the corner, forcing the price down to 10 8/10 cents. They then changed the bull side, buying heavily in all markets of the world. This was continued until early in 1893, bringing the price back to 15 cents. Although his associates then returned to the bear side, Kaltenbach kept on buying, and aided by bad crop reports from Brazil, he worked the price up as high as 17 7/10 cents. At one time it was said that his profits were more than $1 million. The collapse of this deal occurred in May 1893, involving 30 firms in Hamburg, Havre, and Rotterdam. As Kaltenbach could not keep his large New York holdings margined, they were thrown on the market, bringing about a sharp break and causing the failure of his New York agents, T.M. Barr and Company. The present era of large crops began in 1894, Brazil's production for 1894 to 95 being placed at 6,695,000 bags. Nevertheless, Guzman Blanco, a former president of Venezuela, then living in Paris and said to be worth about $20 million, attempted to run a corner in April 1895. He bought 200,000 bags of spot coffee in Havre warehouses and accumulated a big line of futures in various markets. Assisted by reports of cholera in Rio and some reduction in Brazilian crops, he enjoyed temporary success, the price of Rio 7s in New York rising to 15 1/2 cents in October 1895. Thereafter, there was an almost continuous decline. In the spring of 1898, a vigorous bear campaign was conducted, largely in the form of market letters, and by November, Rio 7s here had dropped to 4 1/2 cents. The bubonic plague boom. The so-called bubonic plague boom halted this prolonged downward movement for a time in 1899 to 1900. The boom derived its name from the outbreak of bubonic plague in Brazil, as a result of which the ports of that country were quarantined. In addition, Brazilian steamers arriving at New York were placed in quarantine, and the impossibility of unloading their cargoes caused a temporary shortage. As a result, prices rose from 4 1/4 cents in September 1899 to 8 1/4 cents in July 1900. The quarantine being lifted, the bears again became aggressive, and by April 1901 they had forced the price back to 5 cents. There was another short-lived attempt to establish a corner in September 1901. Receipts at Rio and Santos had been running light, encouraging a local clique embracing Skiddy, Minford and Company, W.H. Crossman and Brothers, and Gruner and Company to endeavor to gain control. The arrivals at Brazilian ports suddenly increased to the largest volume ever known up to that time, and, with vigorous opposition from operators in Havre, the corner here was speedily broken. The opening of the new century witnessed the beginning of another new coffee era, Santos permanently displacing Rio as the world's largest source of supply. The figures for 1900 to 1901 were Santos 2,945,000 bags and Rio 2,413,000 bags. Huge crops then became a regular thing in Brazil. That of 1901 to 1902 was far in excess of estimates, being 15 million bags, while 20 million bags were produced in 1902 to 1903. As a result, the world's coffee trade became completely demoralized for the time being. In August 1902, contracts for July 1903, delivery sold at 6 1/10 cents. By June 1903, they had fallen to 3 55/100 cents, the lowest price ever recorded for coffee. The Southern Boom. As is invariably the case when prices reach extreme levels, either high or low, the pendulum swung back rapidly in the other direction. Based on the unprecedentedly low prices, the so-called cotton crowd started what was generally known as the Southern Boom. Various cotton traders in New York and the South, under the leadership of D.J. Sully, the one-time cotton king, and ably assisted by prominent local coffee firms, became extremely active on the buying side, and by February 1904 they had forced the price up to 11 85/100 cents. This figure, the highest since 1896, was reached on February 2nd, which proved to be another day of enormous speculative dealings, involving roundly 462,000 bags. This marked another turning point, the 3 succeeding days of record-breaking operations on the exchange witnessing a break of roughly 2 cents. Mr. Sully went on a vacation on February 3rd, and the silken interest sold on a large scale. Business for that day was placed at 555,000 bags, closing prices being about 1/2 cent lower. This brought on enormous liquidation by Western bulls on the following day, approximately 500,000 bags. As a result, prices lost 25 to 65 points on a turnover of about 642,000 bags. All records for business were smashed on the following day, February 5th. The official record was 689,000 bags, but trade estimates made it more than 1 million bags. On that day, Southern interest liquidated heavily, causing net losses of 80 to 90 points. Doubtless the break would have been more severe had it not been for buying by the silken people and several other strong interest, and at below 7 1/4 cents for September contracts. The story of valorization. The valorization, or equalization, of coffee originated in Brazil. When the original plan was threatened with disaster, Herman Silken stepped in and saved the Brazil planters from ruin, the Brazil government from possible revolution, and, incidentally, won for himself and those who were his partners in the enterprise much unenviable notoriety. The principle of valorization is generally conceded to be economically unsound, because it encourages overproduction, and valorization in Brazil would have been a failure had it not been for a fortuitous combination of short crops, Herman Silken's genius, and the World War. Because of the lessons learned in this experience, Brazil's subsequent valorization enterprises have run more smoothly. A rapidly increasing world demand, a wonderfully fertile soil, and cheap labor kept the Brazil coffee industry in a flourishing condition nearly to the close of 1889. Coffee consumption was increasing, especially in the United States. By April 1890, the average import price per pound of Rio No. 7 in this country was 19 cents, and Brazil was supplying only about half our needs. Virgin soil was still available in Brazil, and immigration furnished all the needful labor. Easy profits led to increased investment and careless methods. Her planters were drunk with prosperity. For 6 years, nearly all the 3 million inhabitants of Sao Paulo, Brazil's largest coffee-producing state, entirely gave up planting corn, rice, beans, everything they needed. They bought them because coffee was so immensely profitable that they put all their labor in coffee. Brazil had been going through a period of low exchange. Paper money fell below par. The exaggerated issues of it, which provoked the collapse of exchange, suddenly endowed Brazil with an abundant circulation of money. Production was enormously stimulated. New undertakings sprang up on every hand. Armies of agricultural laborers were recruited in Europe and shipped into the coffee districts. And then, to make the story short, supply passed demand, surplus stocks began to appear, prices began to fall, and fell until they dropped below the cost of production. It was in 1896–97, when the new trees came into bearing by the tens and hundreds of thousands, that Sao Paulo's folly began to tell. By October of that year, the price of Rio No. 7 in New York had fallen to about 7 cents. The decline continued until, in 1903, it hung around 5 cents. Then began the winter of Sao Paulo's discontent. Too late, the state government tried, by taxing new coffee estates, to force the planters to raise crops to supply their own necessities. The times grew harder. Mortgages held by large coffee houses and bankers were being foreclosed. The industry was passing into European hands. The smaller planters were becoming desperate, and desperation is only a step from revolution. The government of the state of Sao Paulo knew this, and to save the state, it finally promised it would buy the next coffee crop, and would hold it for the planters at such a price as would be necessary to continue the industry. The protagonists of this plan to valorize coffee were Dr. Jorge Tibiriza, Dr. Augusto Ramos, and Dr. Albuquerque Lins. During all the period covering Sao Paulo's rise and fall in coffee, the financial genius who was to lead her again into the land of plenty had been quietly acquiring a knowledge of her problems, also the ability to make money out of their solution. Valorization was undertaken to save the coffee industry. Its intent was good, even if the theory was bad. The scheme was not new, and there were no encouraging precedents to augur its success. The situation was desperate, and seemed to justify the trial of a desperate remedy. Sao Paulo attempted to carry the load, but her resources were insufficient. The bumper world crop of 19,090,000 bags in 1901–1902 was followed in 1906–1907 with another extraordinary yield of 24,307,000 bags, of which Brazil alone produced 20,192,000 bags. To make good its promise to the planters, ready cash was needed, and so the Sao Paulo government sent a special commissioner to Europe to get it. For 60 years, the Rothschilds had acted as Brazil's bankers. The commissioner went to the Rothschilds first. He was flatly refused. After that, he was turned down by practically every bank on the continent. It looked as if the bankers had entered into a gentleman's agreement to make it unanimous. Then the commissioner bethought himself of the coffee merchants, and that thought naturally suggested Herman Silken, who, singularly enough, happened to be conveniently resting at nearby Baden-Baden. In August 1906, the commissioner waited upon Mr. Silken and begged his aid. It was Silken's hour of triumph. For years he had been soliciting Brazil. Now the tables were turned, and Brazil was asking favors of Silken. The rest of the story is best told by Robert Sloss, who wrote it for World's Work from information furnished by trade authorities, and even by Mr. Silken himself in various speeches, newspaper articles, and on the witness stand. It is presented here with certain minor corrections by the author. "Well, what do you want me to do?" asked Herman Silken of the commissioner from the state of Sao Paulo. "We want you to finance for us 5 to 8 million bags of coffee," said the commissioner blandly. Here was an adventure. Here was a proposition to lift bodily out of the market half as much coffee as the world's total production had averaged for the 10 preceding years when prices had been so low. Presumably, if this were done, prices would be doubled. But Herman Silken shook his head. "No," he said, "there is not the slightest chance for it, not the slightest." and then he pointed out that there would be no financial assistance coming from anywhere if the Sao Paulo planters kept on raising such ridiculously large crops of coffee. The commissioner assured him that the prospect was for smaller crops in future. Herman Silken was not so sure about it. At a price low enough, he mused, I might be able to raise funds to pay 80% on a value of 7 cents a pound for Rio No. 5. The commissioner was dismayed. His government had already promised to take coffee from the planters at about a cent a pound above the market, and the market then stood at nearly 8 cents. The government would have to dig to make up the difference. Herman Silken's terms were the best that could be got, however, and the commissioner accepted them. From that time forth, Herman Silken was the head of the movement. He approached a few large coffee merchants, including his former rivals, Arbuckle Brothers, and drew up a contract. The merchants agreed to advance 80% of the sum required to buy 2 million bags of coffee at 7 cents a pound. If the market went above 7 cents, the government was to make no purchases. If it fell below 7 cents, the government was to make good the difference to the merchants by cable. Before the season was well advanced, the unexpected happened. Brazil was reaping the largest coffee harvest in the history of the world. The 2 million bags of coffee purchased by the government were as a drop in a bucket. Financed by Herman Silken, Schroeder, the great London banker, and a few prominent European merchants, the government was forced to buy almost 9 million bags. Toward the end of 1907, the government had lifted half of the world's visible supply of coffee, but the market stood only a trifle above 6 cents a pound. The government was practically bankrupt. Herman Silken now enlisted the Rothschilds on his side and shifted the financial burden from the shoulders of the coffee merchants to those of the Paris bankers and their American associates. Then the Rothschilds imposed their conditions on the government of Brazil. A national law was passed determining a heavy penalty for anyone who planted a new coffee tree in Brazil. The government guaranteed that not more than 9 million bags of the next coffee crop and not more than 10 million bags of any succeeding crop should be exported. By the end of 1911, the coffee market stood well above 13 cents. Here was a rise of more than 100% in 2 years, more than 60% in 6 months. Evidently, valorization coffee in the hands of the Bankers' Committee had become a gilt-edged security. But how? During the 5 crop years since the plan was launched on the heights above Baden, nearly 90 million bags of coffee had been raised in the world. The Bankers' Committee still held 5,108,000 bags of this. At the highest estimate, consumption had exceeded production by only 4 million bags. Here was a shortage of only a little more than 10% in supply as against demand, so far as crops go. Yet there had been a rise of more than 100% in 2 years in the price of coffee on the New York Coffee Exchange. Upon the merchant's ability to deliver coffee on the New York Coffee Exchange depends the price of coffee in the world. That explains why the Bankers' Committee, from the beginning, refused absolutely to sell valorization coffee on the public exchanges of the world. In Europe, they put it up at auction, and when it didn't go, it was bought in for them. In America, they announced in a printed circular that valorization coffee would be sold only on condition that the purchaser would not deliver it on the New York Coffee Exchange. Herman Silken absolutely refused to sell coffee to the merchants on the exchange. Arbuckle Brothers kept on buying coffee heavily, as if they would corner the market. They resold the coffee, however, at private sales, exacting a written contract from the buyer that he would not deliver the coffee on the New York Coffee Exchange, or resell it to anyone that would so deliver it. The Coffee Exchange began an investigation, but nothing ever came of it. Shortly after the Valorization Committee had apparently cleared up $25 million in 1 year, the restriction as to the delivery of valorization coffee on the New York Coffee Exchange was officially removed. Yet neither from Herman Silken nor from Arbuckle Brothers, it is charged, could one buy any coffee to deliver for that purpose. In 1911, coffee rose to 16 cents per pound. At the end, it was found that the committee's holdings had been marketed at the various sales on a basis for Santos fours from 8 5/8 cents minimum to the final sale here forced by the United States government, at which time the price realized was 16 3/4 cents for Santos fours and 14 cents for Rio sevens. The one fly in the valorization ointment was Senator G.W. Norris of Nebraska, who early in 1911 called for a congressional investigation of the operations of the valorization syndicate, which he said was costing the American people $35 million a year. The Attorney General was instructed to report as to whether or not there was a coffee trust. It was a leisurely investigation, which encountered many snags placed in its way by those who believed it would be against international policy to question too closely the participation of the Brazil government in the enterprise. Politics played no inconsiderable part in the investigation, which dragged along until May 18, 1912, when an action was begun in the Federal District Court for the Southern District of New York, alleging conspiracy and restraint of trade on the part of Herman Silken, Bruno Schroeder of J. Henry Schroeder and Company, Edward Bunge, the Vicomte de Touchet, Dr. Paulo da Silva Prado, Theodore Weil, the Société Générale, and the New York Dock Company, also praying for injunction and receivership of the valorization coffee then stored in the United States, and amounting to 746,539 bags. The injunction was denied. Immediately thereafter, rumors began to circulate that the government's coffee suit would never be tried. The Brazilian ambassador threatened diplomatic interference, and Attorney General Wickersham let it be known that a friendly settlement might be effected. Silken boldly challenged the authorities to prosecute the case, and even seemed to invite criminal proceedings against himself. Saving the government's face and Brazil's face, at one and the same time, proved to be a long and tedious process. Meanwhile, Senator Norris introduced in Congress a bill designed to give the government power to seize importations of coffee when restraint of trade was proved. It was vigorously opposed by many prominent green coffee men and roasters, but in February 1913 it became enacted into law. It effectively killed all future valorization schemes insofar as direct participation by this country is concerned. About December 1, 1912, Attorney General Wickersham accepted good faith assurances from Mr. Silken's attorney, who represented also the Brazil government, and agreed that if the valorization coffee stored here was sold to bona fide purchasers before April 1, 1913, the government suit would be dismissed. In May 1913, the Attorney General of the new Wilson administration, which came into office in March of that year, issued a statement saying that good faith assurances having been received from the Brazil government that the understanding was fulfilled in letter and spirit before the date set by the previous Attorney General, and the entire amount of coffee disposed of to 80 dealers in 33 cities, the suit would be dismissed. In the United States Senate about the same time, Senator Norris renewed his attack on the International Coffee Trust. He charged that the coffee sale was not as represented, but merely a transfer, and called upon the Department of Justice for the facts, with names of the alleged purchasers. Attorney General McReynolds, on May 7, 1913, declined to send to the Senate the official correspondence in regard to the Brazil coffee valorization matter, because it was incompatible with the public interest. He did, however, send other papers on the subject. The Secretary of State sent copies of some correspondence, but the documents were not made public. This ended the matter, although Senator Norris called for a congressional investigation, charging that the Attorney General had been handed a gold brick. Silken contented himself with remarking that the suit was a mistake in the first place, and that it was a foregone conclusion the government would be defeated. Also, he offered $5,000 to anyone who could explain the Norris bill. Valorization, then, was started by the state of São Paulo in 1905, when a law was passed authorizing the state to enter into an agreement with the other Brazil states and the federal government for the adoption of measures which would assure the valorization of coffee and facilitate a propaganda abroad for increased consumption. The states of São Paulo, Minas Gerais, and Rio de Janeiro proposed early in 1906 to withdraw from the market such quantities of coffee as would keep down exports and maintain profitable prices. The plan comprehended the interested states borrowing about $75 million from European and United States bankers with which to buy up the surplus coffee. To take care of interest and amortization, a tax of 3 francs per bag of 132 pounds, about 57 cents, was to be levied on all coffee exports, collectible at Santos and Rio de Janeiro. Further coffee planting was to be checked by enforcing the law which carried a tax sufficiently high to operate toward restriction. When it was understood that Brazil's federal government would not endorse the plan in toto, it was abandoned by Rio de Janeiro and Minas Gerais. However, the state of São Paulo, in the course of the next 2 years, borrowed some $30 million on its own account for valorization purposes, obtaining half the amount direct from foreign banking interest, and the remainder, through the Brazilian federal government, from London sources. This first valorization was abandoned in favor of the Silken Plan, which the federal government ratified in July 1908. By this new plan, São Paulo borrowed $75 million from the syndicate composed of American, English, German, French, and Belgian bankers. Out of this, it repaid the $30 million loan. The 1908 loan was to expire in 10 years in 1919. Under the plan of the new loan, it was agreed that certain amounts of the valorized coffee should be stored as collateral in warehouses in New York and Europe, in charge of a committee of 7, who were authorized to sell the coffee in the markets in specified quantities and at prices that would not disturb the price of other coffees. The composition of the committee was as follows: Dr. Francisco Ferreira Ramos, of São Paulo and Antwerp, who was succeeded by Dr. Paulo de Silva Prado, the Vicomte de Touchet of Havre, the Société Générale of Paris, the firm of Theodore Weil of Hamburg, Hermann Silken of New York, Edward Bunge of Antwerp, and Baron Bruno Schroeder of J. Henry Schroeder and Company of London. Brazil agreed to purchase 10 million bags and to hold them off the market until conditions warranted their sale. It was also agreed that the total exports of unvalorized stocks from Brazil would be restricted to 10 million bags for 1907 to 1908, and to 10,500,000 bags for 1909 to 1910. In addition, a surtax of 5 francs gold per bag, 96 1/4 cents, was placed on every bag exported to pay carrying charges. The management of the government's holdings was placed in the hands of the International Committee. This committee issued bonds which were quickly subscribed for, and because of its efficient handling of its huge holdings, prices held steady in spite of the record-breaking Brazilian crop of nearly 2,192,000 bags in 1906 to 1907, and a later one in 1909 to 1910 of about 15 million bags. Indeed, there was an advance of about $10 a bag between 1904 and 1911. Valorization had the effect of stabilizing the Brazil market and giving the planters and allied interests the assistance they needed to ward off the disaster that threatened them through overproduction. The United States government action in 1912 forced the sale of the valorized stocks held in this country, and the Congress passed the law making it impossible again to offer for sale in America stocks of coffee held under similar valorization agreements. The coffee situation became so serious in 1913 that São Paulo again entered the money market for another loan, borrowing $37,500,000 through the good offices of the Brazilian federal government, following this up 2 years later with another loan of $21 million. According to a semi-official statement issued in Brazil early in 1919, the status of valorization at that time was that the first loan of $75 million of 1908 had been entirely liquidated, and the 2 later loans were greatly reduced. At the same time, it was announced by the president of the state of São Paulo that the surtax of 5 francs would be withdrawn as soon as the liquidation of the loans had been completed. This surtax, however, is still in effect. In 1919, the São Paulo government proposed advancing the pauta, or export duty, very materially. A strong protest was made by all the exporters, and a compromise was at last effected by which the proposed increase in the pauta was cancelled, and the existing surtax of 5 francs per bag continued as an offset. The valorization project just described was the second of its kind, a former attempt having proved a failure. At that time, 1870, the Brazilian government had been a large purchaser of Rio coffee, buying it in lieu of exchange, as it had large remittances to make. The coffee was sold through G. Amsink & Company, and it is believed that heavy losses were sustained. Since the silken valorization enterprise, the Brazilian government has promoted 2 more valorizations, one in 1918, another early in 1922. End of section 50. Read by Casey Roddy, Knoxville, Tennessee, August 2022.